Okay, Esther, today we're actually exploring an animated, is it Pixar series called
Uh-huh.
Elemental? Pixar,
So
right?
it was on Disney Plus, so it's probably
Disney
Disney.
Plus.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So I'm assuming Pixar, but I'll fact check myself and I'll put it on the lower thirds of the screen. But Esther, why'd you choose Elemental for today's podcast episode?
Mostly because I connected to it so much that the first time that I watched it, I was bawling tears.
Really?
Like, oh my God, yeah. I mean, I had the same response with Turning Red, so
Well, so for people who haven't watched Elemental on Disney Plus, why don't you give us a rundown of what it is, what it's about, and then we'll go into the specifics of the themes later.
yeah, sure. So, it's about this land, made up land of like each category of people is a different element. So there's fire, water, earth, and the main character is a fire girl, and she is set. Her story is that her family immigrated to this land. It's her response and started this shop as part of this really like equivalent to the American dream, right?
Mm.
Um, and it's her duty to then take over the family shop, and like follow her through the story, and you realize she's got a lot of anger that she's holding in. Like there's a lot
Mm.
going on here, and ultimately it comes out that she doesn't really know if she wants to run the shop. In fact, she has these other interests of being an artist, of a glass blower, right? Which is a really interesting idea. And then and as she kind of delves into these dreams that she has, she also meets this guy who's a water boy, and fire and water are not supposed to mix. But then they fall in love, and she goes through a lot of this internal turmoil of, what do I do with this? How do I live my life? How do I want to live my life? What does it look like to live life on my own terms? And navigating all of the, like, child of an immigrant family, responsible for caring for everybody else,
Wow.
and grappling with that fear of disappointment. Yeah.
I can see why you got emotional because I feel like as we're both children of immigrants and we both immigrated here when we were around 5-ish years
Hmm.
old.
Hmm.
And there's just something about living in LA where like it's so common. And then something about the main character's story growing up in fire and meeting someone in water. I feel like it kind of represents like different cultural experiences
Yeah.
and how like dating someone can awaken you to a completely different world and experience, and it's exciting but also scary. And so
Hmm.
there's a lot of that going on in the movie. um like one of the things that the trailer really emphasizes, because before coming on here I watched it, was that like the character is clearly of an Asian descent. Just if you analyze it, like the parents have an Asian accent, and so a lot of this is an exploration of like Asian American identity, if you
Hmm.
will.
Yeah.
And so going into like the first theme of it, like one of the things that I outlined was family expectations and our mental health.
Mhm.
Where, as the eldest daughter of an immigrant family, like how do you think our cultural expectations impact our own sense of self and well being?
Yeah, I mean, in thinking about the collectivist nature of Asian culture, and those embedded Confucian elements of
Mm.
going with the flow, not standing out, not challenging the status quo, so much of our sense of who we are is rooted in our family and who our parents are, who our communities are, how they live their lives, and that with this expectation, or this idea of being the good daughter. To be a good daughter then means to do whatever your parents are doing, or live your life the way that they're living, hold the same values, uh, have the same kind of relationships, etc. And with Ember, the main character, her name is Ember. I know, so cute.
So
uh,
cute.
she she spends her whole life trying to be this good daughter, right? So there's so much deep love there that I
Mm.
really want to emphasize, because I think that's an element that gets taken away from these kind of conversations a lot, right? All of this is rooted in love. She loves her parents so much, and so it's important for her that she shows up as a good daughter to them, that she receives their approval. And you as you watch the movie, she really struggles with a lot of anger, and it's explosive. Like there's at one point there's this like scale, this of how hot a fire person is burning,
Mm.
and she explodes, and then someone customer in the store goes, wow, I've never seen someone almost turn blue, blue as being like the hottest
Yeah.
fire, right, part of the fire,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
um and I think that anger is really something that provides a lot of information, right? And we like to think of anger as the iceberg, right? Anger is just the top 10% that we see, but there's so much, that's the rest of that 90% that we don't.
Mm.
Disappointment, fear, frustration, grief, whatever it may be. And for her, I do love to see that in this movie, her dad's response to that is not to lash back out at her, but rather he tells her to take a breath and make connections. So
Mm.
take a breath and make a connection with the anger that you're feeling, with the people around you that's maybe causing that anger. And the way that I interpret it is that anger is a symptom of how she's explicitly working against all that she knows herself to be the person that she's told that she needs to be,
Mm.
right? She's expected to take over the business. She's expected to take care of her parents and find a good fire boy and live happily ever after. And in fact, in that resistance of going against who she truly is, she actually is actively working against all that she wants to achieve, right? Because of her anger outbursts, she um, basically, like, there's like a catalyst into getting the business almost shut down. She pushes Wade, the water boy, away, and she's so willing to give everything up to be the good daughter,
Mhm.
which says a lot. And
Yeah.
in the movie, she says the only way to repay a sacrifice is by sacrificing your life too. I know, right? Oof, right? Just like
That's so
speaks
true.
to,
I felt that. I
right?
feel
And
like,
mhm,
sorry to interrupt you, Esther, but one of the things I kind of want to point out is the elements that are unspoken in this movie, Asian American elements. The eldest daughter, number three, I liken it to the anger that we're taught not to feel as Asians, not
mhm,
just in Asian America, but also in the rest of like Asian women population. I noticed that anger is not something that we're taught to deal with. And so we learn to just not.
yeah, push it
Um,
down.
and so, like, when we talk about all of this, like, let's tie in a little bit of personal story of like, it sounds like you relate a lot to this character. If you're open to it, I'd love to know why.
Yeah. Well, also before we move forward, I would like to point out that the director of Elemental is a Korean American man whose dad, who grew up with a dad who owned a string of businesses in the Bronx. And so
Wow.
it's really his personal story that spoke to my personal story.
Wow.
But yeah, I mean, I am an eldest daughter of an immigrant family. My family came when I was 6. And so it's really been a whole lifetime of, and not to mention, my parents are also pastors, and
Hmm.
I've always grown up as a pastor's kid. And growing up as a pastor's kid, especially of a very traditional, conservative denomination and church, there's a lot of pressure. And yeah, there's definitely the sense of expectation of I am expected to live my life the way that they have, be engaged with the church in the way that they have a marriage that resembles theirs. And to be fair, like, my parents have a great marriage, and I'm really lucky to have witnessed that. And it often does. I often struggle with this idea of, well, where is there really room for me and what I
Mm.
want and what I need and where I feel safe? And what if it doesn't align with what my parents imagine for me? Then what? Like, where do I
Mm.
go from there?
The then what question is so scary because it's easier to follow the stigma and the path of least resistance. And
Right.
so, similar to Ember, how did you learn to navigate that? I'm assuming it wasn't an easy road.
How do I navigate that? Oh my god, girl, I'm still trying to figure it out, honestly. But yeah, I mean, I guess it the beginning of that was my only answer. If you had asked me this question back when I was 18, I would say my
Mm,
only answer to living my own life on my own terms was to just separate myself completely. And so that's why I ended up going to school in New York, 3,000 miles away from home. I just needed to get away because I couldn't even imagine what it would look like for me to carve my own life within the context of my family and my community. Right.
mm,
And then during COVID, I came back home and it was supposed to be temporary, but then it ended up not. And that was now, what year are we in? That was almost 4 years ago. And through the process of coming back home is when I was really forced to reckon with, all right, how do I do this? Now I'm a lot older. I have already had a taste of what it looks like to completely live life on my own terms. Now that I'm back home, I get to decide for myself how I'm going to balance this. How do I maintain my relationship with my parents while also being honest with myself?
mm.
And what does that look like for me to be true to my faith, my beliefs, my values, while also, yeah, I mean, just while prioritizing my relationship with my parents. And that's a two-way street, right? Like I can show up in a certain way, but my parents also have to, if I'm going to make changes, my parents are going to just have to change with me.
Yes.
That's how this works.
Yeah.
Otherwise that divide is only going to grow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell me about growing up Korean American Christian, because it's a very different community than people realize, because Korean American church dynamic is extremely homey, it's family, everyone pours into you, you pour into them. And so the complexity of that is that you don't just have to deal with your family, you also have to deal with the church because your dad and mom are both pastors of the church.
Hmm.
And so there's cultural and spiritual factors involved in your life as well. And so, yeah, tell me how you dealt with that.
Again, still figuring that out. Here
Yeah.
I am, fresh age of 30 years old, and I still don't have all the answers with something I've been grappling my whole life. But
Mm,
um, yeah, I mean, church is family, right? And for me in particular, I don't have a lot of biological family close by.
mm,
So I grew up with my church as my family. I mean, these people literally watched me grow up. They saw me throw tantrums as an elementary schooler to going off to college and entering the workforce. And so they are my family. And so which makes it even harder to, again, get my own life on my own terms, because then it doesn't even just feel like I'm letting my parents down, but I'm letting everybody down.
mm. Yeah, it's a lot of pressure to put on yourself. I
Yeah.
um I think that I want to acknowledge your emotional vulnerability because I feel like self-discovery has to come with the acknowledgement of what is. And it sounds like you've done a lot of deep work. And even the way you talk about elemental and the intricate dynamics that go into it, I feel like you really see the characters and what they had to go through, and you understand what all of that is and how hard that is. And so I feel like it's the perfect segue into the next question. Because I want to kind of talk about emotional well being and self discovery, but creating your own sense of self.
Hmm.
How does that contribute to your emotional well being? Because I acknowledge that sometimes people listen to this podcast wanting access to mental health information, but not being quite ready to take that step into therapy. And so
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about how self acceptance, cultivating self identity might help you adapt and create the life that you want.
Well, first off, I would say that sometimes that self-discovery looks super turbulent,
Mm,
right? And that, in thinking about turbulence, that makes me think of that Buddhist metaphor. And it's also a practice in ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, where Pema Chodron says, "You are the sky, and everything else is a weather pattern."
Mm.
Right? So
Yeah.
whether it's thunderstorming or it's sun shining out, you are still the sky. The sky doesn't change. Everything else around it might change. How much sun there is, how many clouds there are, how much it rains, how strong the waves are beneath it all. The sky stays the same, right? And so even as we navigate that turbulence, as we create these navigate different changes, and sometimes they're really extreme changes, how can we remain true to ourselves and our sense of who we are as we discover and maybe even try out new things, right?
Mm.
Knowing that also you're never alone through that process. And I think therapy is definitely a huge resource for those who are able to access support. And so is our community, I think. And so in the movie, ultimately she tells her dad, I don't think I want to do this. I don't think I want to take over the shop. And the reason that she had held on to it for so long was because she was so scared of disappointing him,
Mm.
right? And what she learns through that process is that when we ignore our own truth and our own light, that everybody loses.
Mm.
And on the flip side of that, when we are able to let ourselves shine and shine together, then we all win. And her dad's response to her when she's fully honest with him is, "The shop was never the dream. You were always the dream." I
Oh.
was like, oh my God. It's just like, I think that's definitely like one of the moments in which the waterworks came. Um,
Yeah.
but when we stop resisting the reality of our situations, who we truly are, the pieces start to really fall into place in the way that they should, or
Mm.
the way that they need to, right?
Mm.
She's able to be honest with her dad. She's able to be honest with Wade about her feelings. And in that process, she's breaking a cycle,
Yeah.
right? He's, she, she's able to say, "This is who I am. I still love you. I don't love you any less. And this is what I have to do for me."
Oh, that's good. That's so good. I think that part of the transition that Ember makes is she goes from I'm going to be everything that everyone wants me to be so I
Mm-hmm.
can make you happy
Mm-hmm.
to I can no longer do this. I need to find myself. And I think it creates a dynamic for healthier relationships, not just in family, but also in romantic settings
Yeah.
where it's really beautiful. And there's one question I haven't asked you yet when it comes to boundary setting. How do you think in therapy you allow clients to figure out their own boundaries when it comes to managing guilt and obligation?
Boundaries when it comes to guilt and obligation. Well, what comes to mind first is, where does that live in your body?
Mm.
Where do we carry that guilt, that obligation, and all the other feelings that might come with this fear of disappointment,
That's
right?
good.
And allowing that to guide us in understanding, am I okay here? Or is there a need for boundaries? And boundaries, remember, is we only establish boundaries in the relationships that we want to maintain,
Mm.
right? So do you want to maintain a relationship with this person? And if so, what are the boundaries that we need to make clear, right? Set those expectations of, I love you and this is what I need.
Mm. Esther, what boundaries do you think that we fail to set when it comes to relationship,
Like romantic relationships.
both family and romantic?
I mean, I guess that's the most famous answer of, it depends. um I guess some of the more common ones are, uh again, depending on the context of your relationships, each person, the dynamics, being honest about the lives that we want to live. And so that can be like, where you decide to go to school or what kind of job you choose to work in or go enter, the kinds of friends that you have, or even being honest about our identities, whether we identify as queer or trans, whatever. And I think one actually really big one for especially for Asian families, immigrant children, is drawing a boundary about the way that people corner us into shame.
Mm.
There's
Tell
so
me more about that.
there's this, even this idea of the good daughter, right? To be
Mm.
told that we are the bad daughter or a bad son, it's like an immigrant child's worst. That's the worst thing that you can say to an immigrant child, right? Especially from
Mm.
the parent.
Yeah.
And it creates shame, right? And remember the difference between guilt and shame is guilt is I did a bad thing versus shame is I am a bad person. Right? It's such an internalized messaging that we receive, whether it's about whether or not we are a good child or um, whether we are queer or how we choose to engage with our work settings, in our friendships, or how we choose to dress even, right? When we're not able to draw that boundary, we, especially when it comes to shame, we absorb it and we believe it. Maybe that is a bad thing. Maybe that is bad part of me, or I am bad at its
Mm.
worst. And that is definitely a line that we need to draw.
Mm. This whole theme of like, I am bad because I'm not going with what people want me to do. I feel like that's something that comes up in a lot of the sessions that I work with, especially when it comes to Asian Americans,
Yeah.
because oftentimes we have to look to other to figure out how we should feel versus how we actually feel.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the things I wrote in my notes was Elemental explores the theme of dating outside of one's cultural or social circle and the
Mm-hmm.
complexities of reconciling personal identity with external expectations, meaning cultural expectations.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in the theme of boundaries and relationships, my follow up question to that is how can navigating relationships with individuals from different backgrounds impact our own mental health and self perception?
Such a good question. I'm thinking about our innate biological need to fit in.
Hmm.
Right? And I say this to my clients all the time, if we think back to our ancestors' tribal days, if you didn't fit in with your tribe, if you were kicked out, you're dead. You were not meant to survive in the wilderness on our own. And so it's a
Mm-hmm.
matter of survival to fit in and belong to our community.
Yeah.
And when we are faced with, I think when it's just like one person dating this other person from a different culture, it's a lot easier to navigate. There's not as many factors to consider. But then as that relationship starts to grow, maybe you start to meet their friends, their family members, their greater community, you start to notice the ways in which you're like, ooh, like these people are really different from me in these very specific ways. I don't know if I fit in. It threatens our sense of safety.
Mm.
And something that the movie does really beautifully is Wade and Ember are able to engage with curiosity and find new ways to adapt. Right? At first, they're like, fire and water don't go together. We can't even touch. And so she won't even hold his hand
Mm.
or even like do like fingertips
Finger. Yeah.
until they were like, well, what if? Right?
Mm.
And they do. And they hold hands and it's okay. It's exhilarating, actually. And it changes their chemistry.
Oh.
And there are the ways in which they're able to complement each other. The ways that each person brings their own set of skills, talents, and maybe, lesser talented areas too. The way that they're able to complement each other and say, I see your light, I see your talents, I see you. And this is how we can come together.
Mm. What do you think about their dynamic just in watching the two of them together? Because
They're
when you
so
describe them, it sounds. I'm assuming that you think they're cute, but I'd love to hear your experience.
yeah, no, I think they're super cute. And that's also an element that I really resonate with. Can we even fit together? Can we come together? Do we belong together? Or is it impossible? Can fire and water never mix?
Mm.
And I think Ember and Wade, the way that they navigated of, well, even with at first their disposition is, even if we're different, even if we're not meant to be together, can we just hang out and have a good time? Can
Mm.
we, and then ultimately as that trust builds, they're able to take the next brave step of holding hands and dancing together or sharing a kiss. Yeah.
That's so sweet. Of I think that's also a really healthy approach of looking at dating. Of do I find this person interesting, and can I have openness and curiosity around what it is about them that makes them them? And then you eventually see them meeting each other's families and how different the dynamic is. Like Wade's
Mm-hmm.
family is a lot more goofy and fun loving, and Ember's family is a lot more strict and rigid, and but challenges Wade to try their restaurant cooking, which is very spicy, he says,
Yeah.
but he doesn't like melt. He just like takes it in, and he just like calls it really hot and spicy food. Um, and it's so interesting to see the dance that they do.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that when it comes to like art, different intersections, I think that the show really touches on that too. Of not only do you have the romantic element of Wade and Ember, you also have the intersection of culture and duty and job and society. And so
Privilege.
like I think that when someone's entering into the therapy room and connecting it to mental health, I think that they think that they're going into it with an issue,
Mm-hmm.
but as therapists, we give perspective to it isn't just about this, it's also about all of these different things that you might not see under the surface. And so connecting elemental to, the intersectionality of everything. What do you think some people miss about watching this movie as a therapist?
I mean, there's so many elements. That's
Mm-hmm.
punny. But yeah, there's so
Punny.
many elements in that come into play. Honestly, like, okay, no, let me keep that to myself. Wade's family, as you described, they're very fun loving. They're also very sensitive. They
Yeah.
cry together,
Yeah.
and for an Asian family, that's like, what is like? Do we need to go to the hospital? Are you okay? you
Mm-hmm.
know,
Mm-hmm.
and Wade really represents is a representative of a lot of privilege. And if I watched the director's cut, basically, and his explanation of all of this, and so it's specifically created in that way. And you'll see through the movie, the fire people are always saying, "This city is not made for us."
Mm-hmm.
Right, speaking to that greater institutionalization aspect of the systems at play are not made for us. And there's a lot of grief in that, of struggling and surviving to make a living, raise a family, be in community in a place that's not made for you. Right. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that can go for people of color, it goes for neurodivergence, it goes for queerness, and different religions. And 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 so yeah, so the director describes it as, well, if you think about the order of the creation of earth, water was first, and then the earth, and then fire.
Mm.
So Wade represents this first group of people, whereas Ember represents the last. um, and and it really speaks to Asian American immigrant families too, of our families have become live the lives that they do out of survival, right? So many of us come from contexts of war, poverty, famine, that's not so removed from us. Like maybe our grandparents experienced it, maybe our parents may experience it, maybe we experienced it ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And we've learned to adapt in very specific ways that ensured our survival. And I
Yeah.
think the lack of maybe talking about feelings, a lack of affection sometimes, most many times, really speak to so much of that hard work ethic, that maintaining the status quo as survival too.
Mm.
Right, if we're challenging what we know to work, then that get creates a greater chance for failure.
Yeah.
And so we stick to what we know,
Yeah.
maintain the status quo.
Mm. Yeah. I had a mentor say this to me. She said, familiarity is a really powerful drug. It keeps you stuck in the same place that you've been in. And
Sure.
so I feel like, going into Asian American history, going into Elemental, going into your story, even Esther, my story, I think that when it comes to like immigration, familiarity is a really powerful drug. Like, even
Mhm.
though I'm at a place where I am making a lot of money, I want to make my parents proud. And so what would it look like to like financially support them? A lot of Asian Americans are doing that.
Mm.
Not because they necessarily want to, but also because they have to at times.
Yeah.
There's also elements of, what am I going to do outside of this? This is the right thing to do. So
Hmm.
everyone either becomes a doctor or an engineer. And so going into like the creative field, even from personal experience, is really scary,
Hmm.
because what are you going to do with that degree in all quotation marks? Like, if you're not going to be sure. And so I'm curious about, like, when it comes to healing those parts of um, unlearning cultural expectations, forging authentic connection. Like, how can someone learn steps to empower themselves in that process?
So yeah, I mean, I do want to kind of put emphasis in this piece of wisdom that your mentor offered of, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
there's staying the familiar. We need
Mm-hmm.
to maintain the status quo in order to keep the culture alive, keep the people alive, keep our roots sturdy and grounded.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the beauty of being bicultural, multicultural people, or multi-identifying people, is that we get to decide what we're going to leave behind and what to take with us.
Mm-hmm.
And so at every moment in which we clash with what we know to be the norm, I think it's worth taking that time to think about, how does this still serve me? How does this serve us? And is it serving us in the way that actually benefits us right now? Or is it
Mm-hmm.
actually keeping us back, keeping us stifled?
I like what you said of, you get to decide.
Hmm.
You get to decide what you take with you and what you don't. And I don't think a lot of people know that they can do that or have permission to do that, you
Yeah,
know?
it's scary.
Mm-hmm.
It's uncharted territory.
How often do you think fear holds us back from change?
Oof, so often.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's safety in the familiar. And so anything outside of what's familiar threatens our sense of safety.
Yeah. If someone's listening to this and they're going, okay, we've talked about Elemental, we've talked about Esther's story, we've talked about the dynamics around Asian American mental health, how then, when it comes to like the practical, how can I unlearn that fear? Should I unlearn that fear? What can I do about all of this fear?
It's up to you. Is what I would say.
Yeah.
I think I do try to personally. I try to avoid the word should.
I like
Shoulds
that.
cultivate,
Hmm.
because if you decide not to challenge and confront that fear, then I don't think that you need to feel bad about it. As long as you are okay with the life that you live,
Yeah.
there's no right or wrong answer.
Mm. If you're okay with the life that you're living, there's no wrong answer.
Right.
That's good. So I think that's a great first step of, are you okay with the life that you're living?
Yeah. Or is
Mm,
there a lot of anger, sadness, maybe
mm,
depression, anxiety that give us information and context into our inner realities? And sometimes, and I do also want to emphasize, um, there's a difference between acceptance, or fine line between acceptance and emotional overriding, as we might call it.
mm,
Acceptance is that true, deep, this is hard and this is difficult, and I have a lot of feelings about it, and I'm okay, or I can be okay. Whereas emotional writing, overriding is, yep, yeah, no, that happened. We're good. We're fine. I feel nothing. We're all
mm.
right. Let's move on.
Yeah, it's kind of like what people, I don't know if you've heard the term spiritual bypassing.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like, I'm not going to hold space for my own internal spirit and my own intuition because I don't want to. And so it reminds me of that term, but centering around emotional capacity, where it's a lot of people, I think about the gratitude practice as emotional overriding, but there's a difference
Mm,
between learning it, processing the experience, and then eventually getting to a place of, I'm really thankful that this happened because, where it doesn't always have to end with a thank you, but it
mm,
can end with a thank you if you hold
mhm.
space for the emotion, you just accept what is. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. This was painful, and this is how I'm going to move forward.
that's good. Is there anything else about Elemental that you think people should know about? Or when they do watch it, what elements should they look out for?
I personally really liked the storyline of the Vivisteria flower.
Oh.
I haven't seen the trailer, so I don't know if it shows up in the trailer. But so there's this flower that she has always wanted to see since she was a kid. It's this flower that grows under any condition: fire, water, whatever, drought. And there's a flashback scene in the movie where she's a young girl. Her dad has taken her to the botanical garden to see this flower, and she's so excited. She gets to see her favorite flower, and the security guard stops them, and says, "You can't come in here. Go back to Fireland." Right, and so when the director talks about how that speaks to his direct experiences of being told to go back to China, even though he's not even from China.
Hmm.
Right? It's a story of institutional rejection due to differences and lack of understanding. And then Wade, while she's dating Wade, he has this great idea to bring in his cloud friend to make a bubble for her underwater, because at this point the botanical garden has closed. The flower is under water completely.
Hmm.
And so as a fire person, it's virtually impossible for her to be able to go see it now. And he figures out a way. He puts her in this air bubble and guides her through the water, and she's able to see these flowers for the first time. And there's this beautiful scene of this vine-like flower that just blooms like in a succession
Wow.
as they're passing by. And they go through this adventure, and in trusting him and
Hmm.
the talents that he brings into the space, she's able to experience something that she was previously told was not for her.
Wow.
And she probably could have never have experienced it without him.
Hmm.
Right, and the joy that she's able to access in the freedom of breaking out of the norm and the expectations of what she's told she can and cannot do is just so beautiful.
Hmm.
And which then also further inspires them to challenge the norms. And the scene after they come out of the water is when they touch for the first time. And in
Oh.
touching together, they learn that they can dance together,
Oh.
and that what they've been told their whole lives doesn't necessarily have to be their truth.
That's so good. That's so good. I the entire time you were talking about the Vivisteria flower, I was thinking about my own personal experience with relationship and how it really does take trust and vulnerability
Mm-hmm.
to let someone in that way,
Mm-hmm.
to like welcome them into your dreams, to allow them into the things that really hurt and all of the pain,
Yeah.
and allowing yourself to change. I feel like is something we often don't talk about in relationship, where you will change. In the dynamics of a healthy relationship, there's excitement in the sharpening that happens in that process. So
Mm-hmm.
that was so beautiful. Hmm. Thanks for sharing, Esther.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate you. We talked about a lot of different things, but I feel like they were really helpful when it comes to just being a child of immigrants. But I think on top of that, navigating relationships, navigating career and obligation. So this is so good. Any last words before I let you go?
Go watch it. Go cry. Go hold a loved one. And, I think the biggest takeaway really is allow yourself to chart the uncharted.
Mm,
the uncharted of your own life, of your family's life and story. It's safe for you to live your own truth.
That's good. Thanks, Esther. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.